Präteritum tense is what they call it in German. It's also known as the simple past in English, or just the past. When people talk about the past tense in German, this is usually what they mean. And this tense is also known as the written past tense or the narrative past tense. Basically, all of that means that we're learning the past tense that is used for grim fairy tales or anything that is a written story that talks about the past. It's used in newspaper articles quite a bit. And it's just the tense that you'll need to know if you're reading something in German. So it's much more important that you can read and understand what it is that's going on with these sentences rather than being able to produce it yourself. That being said, this is obviously a German class, and therefore I have to test you over this, so you will have to be able to formulate your own versions of this. But before we get into the case too much, or the tense too much, I do want to start with reviewing what tenses we know so far and why and how they're used. So the first tense we ever learned was the present tense. And this in German would be Präsens. And the Präsens is used for things that are happening right now or things that started in the past and are continuing on into the present. And so this could be something like, Ich kaufe Schuhe. Ich kaufe Schuhe just means I am buying shoes, and that's obviously happening right now in the moment. You could also use this as something that's continuing on from the past. So like, Ich wohne seit 2009 in Evil. So, ich wohne seit 2009 in Edwardsville. I have lived in Edwardsville since 2009. In English, you may have noticed that I changed to I have lived. That's what we call in English the present perfect tense, and that happens because it started in the past. Even though it's continuing on in the present, we still use just the present perfect in English, and in German we still use the present tense for that kind of sentence. Whenever we want to use the future tense, we can do it a couple of different ways. We can use the present tense and then imply the future with the time element of the sentence. Future. In German, we call the future tense the Futur 1. And the reason we call it Futur 1 is because there is a Futur 2. Futur 2 is what we call in English the future perfect tense, which is essentially things like I will have gone, I will have purchased, those kinds of things. But we're not there yet, so that's Futur 2. But in order to make future 1, we can either use Ich kaufe morgen Schuhe, which is like I am buying shoes tomorrow, which as I just did in English, you can say there's something in the present tense, but use the time element of the sentence to imply the future. You can also use the verb werden, which is the way that we used it last year, where you can say like Ich werde Schuhe kaufen, which is to say it's not happening right now, but I will buy shoes, so ich werde Schuhe kaufen. That's the explicit future tense, as opposed to just the version here with morgen, indicating the time when it's happening. Then we had the present perfect, which in German we just called perfekt. And perfect is used just for the past tense things whenever you're speaking in German. This is the one that has either haben or sein, and then a past participle, which is generally made up of a GE, a stem, and either a T or an EN. Okay, so things like Ich habe Schuhe gekauft, which is just I bought shoes, okay? Same sentence as before, but this is already in the past tense. When speaking, this is what we use. When we're writing something in German, we use what we call in English the preterite. In German, we call this the Präteritum. And this tense is known by a long list of names. I already mentioned them earlier, but They are simple past or written past or narrative past. All of those forms essentially just means that it's written and it's in the past. That's it. So this could be anything that you can say in the perfect tense with things like ich habe Schuhe gekauft. You can use in this tense now. And you could say ich kaufte Schuhe, which is I bought shoes. Ich kaufte Schuhe. And you may notice that the only difference between this present tense version I have up here and this past tense version that I have down here is a T. That's it. It's ich kaufte. There's a T instead of ich kaufe. Okay, so this is where pronunciation is kind of important. Make sure that you enunciate well enough that I know the difference between ich kaufe and ich kaufte. And then that's regular verbs are formatted like that. Okay, as we had in the present tense, we have to be able to conjugate verbs. So in the present perfect tense or the perfect tense, we didn't really have to worry about that too much because we used haben and sein and we just conjugated those two verbs. And then the only thing we had to worry about was what is the past participle of this verb? And then we just put that at the end of the sentence. But in this tense, whenever we're conjugating verbs, we have to actually have the correct form of the verb that fits our subject in that particular sentence. So first of all, we need to know our endings. So we would have te, test, te, ten, tet, ten. So these are the endings that you would associate with ich, du, er, sie, es, wir, ihr, sie. All of those conjugation charts that we did in the last year and a half or so, all of them are the same, except now, instead of just having an E for the ich form, we now have this T added to it. Instead of having just an ST for the du form, we now have T plus an extra E. And now the er, sie, es form is weird because the er, sie, es form is now the exact same as what it was for the ich form. And this will always be the case. It doesn't matter if it's a regular verb or an irregular verb, the ich and er, sie, es forms of all verbs in this tense are going to be the same every single time, no exceptions, perfect every time. Same thing is going to happen with the wir form being en and the z and z form going to be en or ten in this case. So all of that works out so that we could say something like ich kaufte. Du kauftest. Er, sie, es kaufte. Wir kauften. Ihr kauftet. Sie and sie kauften. So all of this, we just do the same as we did for any other conjugation thing. We just drop the en, and then we add all of those endings to there. So ich kaufte, du kauftest, er, sie, es kaufte, wir kauften, ihr kauftet, sie kauften, sie kauften. This is the easy part of it so far. And then we have verbs like arbeiten. Arbeiten is a regular verb in every single tense. It doesn't change in any weird way whatsoever, but it also ends with a T at the end of the stem. So if we got rid of the en, we would end up just having Arbeit as our stem. And since this ends in a T, and now all of our endings start with a T, we now have two T's in a row. So to avoid this, we of course have to add an E, same thing that we did in the present tense, except now instead of being an STD rule that only affects the du, er, sie, es, and ihr forms, it affects all of the forms because all of the forms have a T in them now. So we start with our stem, Arbeit, 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 Arbeit. And then we have to add our endings, te, test, te, T-E-N, T-E-T, T-E-N. And obviously you can't pronounce that, and so we have to add that extra E in there, and we end up with Ich arbeitete, du arbeitetest, sie es arbeitete, wir arbeiteten, ihr arbeitetet, sie arbeiteten, sie arbeiteten. That does mean that you do sound like you're stuttering with any verb that ends in a T in this tense, but that's just the way it is. It also means that the ear form of arbeiten in the simple past tense is the most irritating word to say in the entire language. Arbeitet. It's really annoying to say, but it is T-E-T-E-T at the end of arbei. Arbeitet. It's the same thing for if there's a D at the end, let's say reden. My other example I always lean to, you would have redete, redetest, and so on. And it also applies to verbs like regnen. If you want to say it rained in German, you would say es regnet. So we have that extra E before we have our TE for the RZS form there. Those were all of the regular verbs. Irregular verbs are irregular. I know, so insightful. All right, so irregular verbs are irregular. The endings for these are slightly different, and that is there is no ending for the Ich form and the RZS form. Every other form, though, just gets the same as what it did in the present tense. So now we have no ending for Ich, ST for do, no ending for RZS, EN for the wir form, T for the ear form, and EN for those two Z forms. So for instance, everyone's favorite verb, sein. Sein is confusing in every tense that you'll ever use it in, but in this tense, it actually works out relatively well, and that's because in the past tense, war. War is our stem. This is the form of the verb that we're going to use in all of our forms. So we say war, 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 and war. And then we have to add our endings where needed. There is not an ending for the Ich form or the RZS form. Like I said, they're going to be using the same forms for each one of those. So no ending, just war. This then has an ST at the end of the do form, so du warst, and then wir waren, ihr wart, and sie waren. So you could say, wo warst du gestern? So where were you yesterday? Wo warst du gestern? You could say, ich war zu Hause. I was at home, because it's what we all are doing. So ich war zu Hause. And these are the forms that you would use for that verb, for sein. As you may have recognized, war has no bearing on the word sein, because we went through the infinitive, sein, the simple past, war, and then the perfect tense, gewesen. And if you want, you could put that ist up there like we had before for that other tense. So, ich bin, ich war, ich bin gewesen for the ich forms in all of those tenses. Present tense, simple past, and then the perfect tense. Haben is also still similarly weird. So we have our normal form of the verb. The stem of haben is hatte. And then we have to add our endings. So ich hatte, du hattest, sie es hatte, wir hatten, ihr hattet, and sie hatten. So again, just the endings that we normally would have on the present tense, with the exception of the ich and RZS forms, and then just whatever the stem is, in this case, hatte. There are patterns here, and these patterns can help you to figure out what forms verbs will take. And then once you get these patterns down, you can predict what the pattern is going to be for other verbs. So if there's like beginnen, begann, begonnen. Okay, so we went from an I in the present or the infinitive form, an A in the simple past, and an O in the perfect tense. If you follow this same pattern, we have this throughout the rest of this list. So there is sprechen would be an example. So sprechen is the infinitive, but you also may recognize that it was irregular in the present tense and it took an I there. So that's just eraser. There we go. So in the present tense, this took an I, and in this past tense, we're going to change this to an A, so sprach, and then gesprochen. So this essentially uses the same pattern as this other one of beginnen, begann, begonnen, sprechen, sprach, gesprochen. Because if it's ich spreche, du sprichst, that has an I in there for the present tense. So I, A, O. This is also going to happen with schwimmen, schwamm, geschwommen. That's the fun one to say. Schwimmen, schwamm, geschwommen. And this one again goes from an I in the present tense or in the infinitive, and then schwamm with an A and then an O for geschwommen. And so there's a lot of verbs in German that have this same pattern. And if you recognize that pattern, then you can kind of memorize these verbs a little bit easier rather than having to overthink things. Unfortunately, not all verbs that have an I in this in the infinitive or in the present tense are going to have this same pattern. So you have a lot of other verbs that do different things. So you have, let's say, the verb essen, for instance. Essen changes to the very popular as. It's spelled with an S set, by the way, because this word is actually the word for an ace in German. So that's a different word, but it is a German word and it's not inappropriate. But the word essen changes to as in the simple past, and then gegessen. And then we also have, let's see, there's another one that does geben, gab, gegeben. Geben, gab, gegeben. So basically what happened was we have an E in the original one, and this E changes to an I whenever it's in the present tense. Then we have an A in the simple past, and then infinitive with a GE in front. So GE plus the infinitive, which is what gegessen and gegeben would both be classified as the category for the perfect tense. And this is going to happen with a lot of the verbs on the list. So we have liegen, lag, gelegen, for instance. Liegen, lag, gelegen. So lie, lay, lay. This one has an IE instead of just an I or an E, but because it starts with that I, that helps. In this category over here again, we have singen, sang, gesungen. And this one you may recognize obviously is going to have a U instead of an O, but this is again the similar pattern to the I, A, O and I, A, U. Those are the main patterns for those. But it goes beginnen, begann, begonnen, bleiben, blieb, ist geblieben, bringen, brachte, gebracht, denken, dachte, gedacht, essen, aß, gegessen, fahren, fuhr, ist gefahren, and so on, over and over and over again in my head in order to memorize that list. Is everybody still awake? We're going to do one more slide here, just kind of a recap of everything so that you understand what it is. We call this in English Präteritum, or in German Präteritum, and it is also called the written past. So called because it is used when writing. So we have to use this when writing about things in the past tense. If it is a regular verb, we add our TE endings, which are basically the present tense endings with a T in front. But the ich and RZS forms are the same. So ich, TE, and the RZS form also TE. Irregular verbs don't have an ending for the ich form. ST for the do form. Again, no ending for the RZS form. And then EN, T, and EN for the last part of the chart.